Let's get back to the physics of a meltdown. This theory that a meltdown is somehow dangerous to the public is predicated on the release of enough radioactive isotopes into the environment. Now, there is no doubt that a molten reactor core is very radioactive, but that's not all you need to be dangerous. To be a threat to human health, any toxin, chemical or nuclear, needs to have three characteristics. The first, it needs to be at a dangerous level of toxicity. Okay, that makes sense. The second, it needs to be able to move through the environment. And the third, it needs to be able to accumulate in human biology. Toxicity, movement, and accumulation. Missing one of those three, there is no public hazard. If I were to sum up the chemicals in just the furniture of this room, it would possess a higher toxicity than anything inside a reactor. But we're not worried about these chemicals. How the heck would it get inside of us? Why, when it becomes waste, do we just toss it in a landfill? Because even normal landfills are designed to very inexpensively control the movement of waste pretty easily by just tossing some dirt on top of it. And if little bits do move over the years, that's fine. By definition, that prevents the accumulation piece because it takes a very long time. Quantity, rate, distance. These factors matter when defining a toxin's risk. When a reactor melts down, it releases over 100 different isotopes. Some with a lot of energy, but that lasts just mere moments. Some with a tiny bit of energy, but that lasts millions of years. But there are only 3 such isotopes that are in the Goldilocks zone of toxicity and movability. The real word is volatility, but for purposes of clarity, I'll use movability. Those 3 are cesium-137, strontium-90, and iodine-131. And of those 3, there's only one that can actually accumulate. Iodine-131. Now, what's so amazing about iodine-131 is that it just has an 8-day half-life, which means it's entirely gone within a couple of months. Not millions of years. The dangerous part is gone within 2 months. History. I told you those nuclear developers were toast, right? No, that's not exactly true. Westinghouse's business had 2 sides. One side developed power plants. The other side sold services into utilities, equipment upgrades, safety modifications. Now, let's take a minute to think back to the Great Recession, right? 2008. What if we just let the auto industry collapse? If we didn't bail them out? If all the car developers went out of business? Think about the 2 sides of the auto industry. What would happen? The auto repair shops that were still around with no industry pushback would have lobbied for regulations that grew their business. And before you knew it, you'd be pulling in for a full inspection every 100 hours of driving. After all, better safe than sorry. Back to reality. 1979, 3 Mile Island. An expensive piece of equipment broke in an empty room. Now, of course, there was media attention, playing off the recent China Syndrome movie. They sent reporters in for the hot scoop. But by now, remember, there was no nuclear developer industry left. There was no communications team they sent out to ridicule these reporters, no lawyers to sue them for effectively yelling fire in a crowded theater. No, the developers were long gone. What remained was the services industry. And the services industry did the opposite. They fed the fear. After all, their business was selling safety upgrades. Now imagine you're Jimmy Carter. As the hysteria grows, you call in the experts from both sides. the nuclear industry and those critical of the nuclear industry. And both sides are now telling you the exact same thing, that a meltdown is a catastrophe that must be avoided at any cost. Do we see where this all goes? Where for the next 50 years, both the nuclear services providers and the non-nuclear energy providers benefit from a public fearful of radiation. Regulators would respond to public concern by decreasing the tolerable thresholds of exposure by orders of magnitude. And after 50 years of brainwashing, it has become common understanding that a meltdown is the definition of catastrophe. Physics. Just to give you a sense of how crazy this has gotten worldwide, in Japan, you are only allowed 0.04 becquerels per centimeter cubed of iodine-131. Now, a becquerel is the disintegration of a single atom. The regulatory bodies imply a dangerous dose is 1/25th of an atom. The regulations for iodine-131, when levelized across rate and volume of exposure, are 5 billion times more strict than arsenic. Now, please allow me a moment to mention that vending machines, escalators, champagne bottles, and hot dogs each kill a dozen people a year. Iodine-131 maybe has killed a dozen people in all of human history, and it definitively saves millions every single year in medical procedures. Iodine-131, the isotope that we theorize induces thyroid cancer, is used to treat, anyone? Thyroid cancer. History. After the radiation standards were escalated, the industry got exactly what it wanted. New regulations followed, mandating an extra $300 million in safety upgrades for every single one of the existing plants to prevent, in reality, what was an equipment malfunction in an empty room. Riding on the success of 3 Mile Island upgrades, nuclear services had cemented a new business model. Take every opportunity to scare the public, leverage the all-powerful regulator to sell ever more safety systems into existing assets, mandate capital expenditures on the rates of the taxpayer. 1986, Chernobyl. This plant was a graphite reactor designed specifically to make plutonium. It is as different from a water-based reactor as a fireworks factory is from a furniture factory. But by this time, 0 companies were incentivized to explain this difference. Westinghouse sold another $400 million in safety upgrades for every commercial nuclear plant in the US, even though none of them were based on graphite. 1989, Hanford closes down, and since then, over $100 billion has been spent over 30 years digging and refilling holes in the middle of the desert, even though there was no iodine-131 left after 2 months. 2001, September 11th. This time, security upgrades. 115 armed guards per plant, aircraft shields, missile shields, money, money, money. 2011, Fukushima. An earthquake, a tsunami, blackout, fires, 20,000 drowned, and not a single person was affected by radiation in any way. And despite this, the Japanese government will spend $200 billion on cleanup costs. This was the new nuclear industry's biggest payday yet. Physics. At Fukushima, when a tsunami flooded the reactor building, it took out every single safety system. Can anyone wager a guess as to how much iodine-131 escaped? In the absolute worst case scenario, from 3 gigawatts worth of core meltdowns, 28 grams. 1 teaspoon. This is what the nuclear industry calls a catastrophe. This is what society believes is a catastrophe. 1 teaspoon of toxin being released.